All right, folks, I'm going to make an exception to my rule of not going over readings in great detail this week. As you know, I want you to do the readings, obviously, because I think it is an important exercise for you to do on your own. However, because we're coming off a week that was sort of demanding with NEPA and let's face it, kind of dry, I'll make an exception this week. So this week I'm making 2 videos to go over the main elements of the readings I assigned. 1 video for each reading. This is the first one of those. There are also other videos you'll have to watch, by the way. Anyway, here I'll point to what you need to pay attention to when you read this chapter, and you should, because the quizzes are going to be about the things I point to in this video. So let's get to it. The first thing that is important in this chapter by David Konisky is right here on page 1, which is the definition of what is environmental justice. And notice that the definition says that environmental justice is the idea that people should neither experience disproportionate environmental burdens nor be excluded from the decision-making processes that produce them. You'll notice that there's nowhere here where there's a reference to the topic of racism. So there's a whole literature on environmental racism, but you should know that environmental justice and environmental racism are not the same thing. In other words, you can have problems of environmental justice that affect people that are white, for instance. And so we'll talk about that with the second reading of this week. However, in practice, what happens is that these things correlate highly. What that means is that usually you see problems of environmental justice among minority populations and among non-white populations. You see these problems at a higher rate with these populations than with white populations. So we'll talk about this in a later video that I'm going to put together for you as well. After you understand the definition of environmental justice, I think the next part that is really important here is on pages 4 and 5. So if you scroll down to pages 4 and 5, you'll see the different components of the concept of environmental justice. There's the concept of distributive justice, procedural justice, corrective justice, and social justice. Please go ahead and make sure you understand all of these. Distributive justice and procedural justice are the 2 that are used more often. Distributive justice is simply a process that is fair in distributing the outcomes that it's producing, right? And procedural justice has more to do with whether people can make their voices heard in whatever decision-making process they're participating in. And then you have the issue of corrective justice, which is how do you correct a wrong, basically? Can you actually make a wrong right? And finally, the issue of social justice, which is another dimension of environmental justice as well, which is the broad notion that there should be a just ordering of society where everyone feels that their basic needs are being met, right? That's also another component according to Konisky. The section that follows this one is called Evidence of Disparities. I would say this is a section you shouldn't pay too much attention to. I mean, it's an interesting section, and you should by all means read it, but it's a review of some of the literature that has been produced on the topic of environmental justice, and this literature is constantly being updated. So I'm not going to test or ask you questions about this particular section, although again, it's really interesting. The section Sources of Environmental Biases on page 9, it's also really important, and you should pay attention to this one. This section discusses potential explanations to why is it that we see environmental inequalities. Is it intentional discrimination? Is it neighborhood transition? Or is it an imbalance of political capacity? So all these things, intentional discrimination, neighborhood transition, or also called minority moving, and finally, political capacity. These are all sources of environmental biases as discussed by Konisky. You should know what those are. The next section, Opportunities for Addressing Environmental Justice, is also really important because it shows what are the different mechanisms to deal with the issue of environmental justice, and you have a number of them. The first one is new legislation. Konisky says, well, there's not really great opportunities here in terms of passing new legislation to address environmental justice. He shows how many efforts to deal with environmental justice in Congress have failed through the years, and they continue to fail. So one of the things he doesn't say here, because this is from 2017, but the last major bill introduced in Congress to deal with environmental justice and to recognize environmental justice as a driver of environmental policy was introduced by Senator Cory Booker back in 2017. He's a Democrat senator from New Jersey, and that died in committee, didn't even make it to the floor for a vote. So this, possibilities of new legislation are not that great. Then you go to the next one, which is the use of existing anti-discrimination laws. There's one thing that is really important here, and that's Executive Order 12898. This is an executive order that was passed by the Clinton administration, by President Clinton back in 1994. And this was the first executive order that actually called explicitly for federal agencies to incorporate environmental equity considerations into their programs and policies and activities in general. If an agency is going to put together a rule or a regulation, environmental justice considerations need to be included. Now, there's a number of limitations with the executive order. The main one is that it's actually not something that can be enforced. And that obviously makes this executive order very limited, but it's really important because it was the first political effort to push the topic of environmental justice into the policymaking agenda of the different federal agencies. Moving on, in section Implementation of Existing Environmental Laws, which is on page 21, you'll find a few things that are important. First, the references to how Clinton's executive order specifically mentioned NEPA as an important instrument to analyze the effects of governmental agencies on minority communities and low-income communities. Here's the reference to NEPA on page 22. And so basically, some of the agencies had been trying to abide by this executive order when they came up with environmental impact statements on certain projects. They tried to include analysis of environmental justice considerations, but this language at least has gone away in the new modernization of NEPA that the Trump administration has proposed that we discussed last week. Another thing that is important in this section is that in addition to the executive order, there was also some administrative reorganization, and one of those reforms was the establishment of a dedicated environmental justice office within the EPA. This dedicated environmental justice office is still in place, but the Trump administration has suggested some changes that we're going to be discussing in the next video. The last thing that is really important in this section is actually on page 24. Let me get there. 24, here it is. And it's the references to the fact that under the Obama administration, and particularly with the administration of Gina McCarthy, who was the last EPA administrator that the EPA had under Obama, the EPA developed this thing called Plan Environmental Justice 2014. This is an agency-wide initiative to integrate equity issues into its regulatory activities. This plan, by the way, was in place for a couple of years, and then it was updated in 2016. There's no references to that update in this book chapter, but I'm going to cover that in the next video. So you should know what Plan Environmental Justice 2014 is at its core. What's the goal of the plan. Finally, read section Prospects for the Future, paying special attention to what are the limitations that Konisky identifies for Plan Environmental Justice 2014. All right, everybody, happy reading, and I'll see you in the next video. Thanks.